Well, hey there, idiots. Welcome back to Observe. In today's video, we're going to be looking at a case that was made famous across the globe thanks to the release of the Netflix documentary, Making a Murderer. It's the Steven Avery case. As is the case with all true crime content here on the channel, there are two possibilities that can happen. One, it can be demonetized, or it can be blocked due to the fact that it is close to infringing on YouTube's community guidelines and policy. So I'm going to do my very best to maintain an ad-friendly air throughout the entire video. However, if you are wanting to be able to make sure that I can continue to make true crime content possible for you, there are a couple things that you can do right now to help make that happen. First, you can be a patron of the channel by following the link in the description below. There are various tiers. You have access to various HD backgrounds, live streams, and other Patreon exclusive content, including the ability to instant message with me. I try to make a habit out of responding to any and all questions on my Patreon to the best of my ability. However, if you would like to be able to help support the channel without spending any money, consider following the Audible link below. And I'll explain to you how this means that you can get stuff for free and still support me. So if you follow that link and you sign up for a free trial, you'll have to enter in your credit card number. But if you sign up for that free trial, it donates automatically to the channel, which is fantastic. And you get one free credit. And that free credit you can spend on any audiobook or podcast available on Audible. You can download it and it's yours forever. And if you cancel your trial before it starts charging you, it costs you nothing. AKA, you get a free book, you donate to me, and you don't have to pay a single cent. And the book that I would suggest you check out would be The Dictionary of Body Language by Joe Navarro. He is an ex-FBI agent who has made a name for himself in the nonverbal realm by making quality books and consumable content for people who are interested in reading and learning about how to read nonverbal communication. So if you would like to be able to do that, go ahead and check out the links below. Now moving on into the actual story. Steven Avery was born in 1962. 19 years later, he had his first run-in with the law, where he burglarized a bar and was sentenced to 2 years in jail. However, he was able to be released after just 10 months. Less than a year later, he was again convicted after dousing his house cat in oil and lighting it on fire in front of his friends. He served time for that for a year, and right after getting out, he immediately was convicted again as he drove his cousin's car off the road with his own, got out of his car, and angrily threatened her with a gun. He received a 6-year sentence for that. However, before that very year was up, a tragic crime occurred where a woman was attacked in a park and was assaulted by an unknown man. Now, this is where things start to get a little bit messy, and I have to be extremely open and honest with you right away. One, I have a lot of disgust for the local law enforcement during this case. Two, I have a lot of disgust for the Avery family during this case. There's a lot of terrible things happening during this case, and I had a lot of frustration while weighing through all of the evidence and the possibilities of how that evidence got to where it was at. Regardless, I just wanted to be completely open and honest. This is a bias that I have, and I'm going to be consciously and actively attempting to counteract that bias throughout the entirety of the video in order to maintain as unprejudiced a view as I possibly can. Let's get back onto the Avery story though. The police force immediately suspected Avery just due to his proclivity of violence and lack of self-control. They suspected that he was the one who was guilty of the crime they had just been informed of. From the very beginning, they walked into it with bias. That was the first red flag. They walked into it assuming it was Avery. Also, they primed the victim into saying that it was Avery by mentioning, "This sounds like Avery," while in front of the victim. This is also a terrible idea. You don't prime them towards somebody, but they did. So they primed this victim towards Avery, and then they brought in a lineup of people, and she selected Avery out of that lineup. Now, there are so many suspicions centered around all of this case, and it's just a massive pile of misconduct by local law enforcement. There was a possibly faulty character sketch, and then they also had failed to arrest or bring in a person who was in the area semi-matching the description that the victim had given, who was known for sexual crimes. Needless to say, Avery was found guilty in a crooked system where he served 17 years. In 2002, there was advancement in DNA research and testing that showed that Avery was indeed innocent, and this other person that they knew about but had not brought in because they didn't like Avery was actually guilty. Basically, Avery had served 17 years in a cell for something that he did not do. When he got out, when he was released, he said that he was fine. He was not angry. He was not upset. The past is the past, and he was just happy to be free. That being said, obviously he wasn't that happy because shortly thereafter he sued Manitowoc County, Wisconsin, where he was located, the sheriff that was in charge at the time, and the district attorney who was also running at the time for $36 million for his false imprisonment, the time he lost and the money lost during that time. It was also revealed that insurance was not going to cover the cost of the suit, which meant that the sheriff, the district attorney, and Manitowoc County were possibly going to have to pay from their pockets the large sum of $36 million. Now, for an already crooked law enforcement, that does not seem like good news. And sure enough, a bill is passed in 2005 called the Avery Bill, which was designed to help prevent this sort of instance coming up again. And right shortly thereafter, on October 31st, Teresa Halbach, who was a freelance photographer working for the Auto Trader magazine, was going to the Avery salvage yard to be able to snap some photos for Stephen for the magazine. She arrives at 2:30 in the afternoon on October 31st and is never heard from or seen again. A few days later, on November 3rd, her mother reports her missing and an investigation launches directed at Stephen Avery. In that was the last place that Teresa was seen. Now I'm going to put a pause on this real quick because I want to be able to speak my mind. This is a very tragic incident, and my heart goes out to the Halbach family and friends and relatives. While this video is centered around the possible innocence or guilt of Stephen Avery, a life was tragically lost during this time. So my heart goes out to her family and friends and relatives, and you have my deepest condolences. I know that justice doesn't mean that it makes it easier, but I also know that it can bring a sense of fairness and closure. And that is the point of today's video. Now that being said, back into the story of things, people are highly suspicious, understandably so, of the law enforcement in the area. Did they handle this investigation correctly? And there are two main parties for Stephen Avery's case. The first one is that he is absolutely guilty and that he is exactly where he needs to be. And the other one said that the police framed Avery in order to possibly get out of a potentially massive lawsuit. Now, there are some details that I am not going to include in this story about the incident itself due to the graphic nature of the content. If you would like to be able to know more about it, I have linked a short article below so that you can read up on it. Or you can go and watch Making a Murderer. That being said, I do not like the Making a Murderer documentary because it is immediately and obviously weighted towards one side of an argument rather than both. And having worked in the media for some time, I understand the drive, the need to make things sensational. And so I have no respect for the media in this situation because of its bias and weighted approach to this case. That being said, from the night of November 3rd, 2005, a 2-week investigation begins to ensue towards the Avery salvage yard, where they find the RAV4 of Teresa, the key inside Avery's house, and also human remains in a fire pit that Stephen Avery himself was seen stoking. Now, this case seems to be a slam dunk case on many facets. There's DNA evidence. He's the last one to have talked to her. All of the remains are found on his lot, but there are many, many instances of malpractice from the law enforcement as well. Needless to say, as I continued to dig deeper and deeper into the evidence of this case, I found more and more instances of malpractice and bias seeping into a case where there should be none of that. And that is from the law enforcement and from the media and from those who are studying it. It is all riddled with bad practices. As I said, I found a lot of disgust for this case. So today I'm going to be analyzing two different pieces of footage. One is from an interrogation that happened sometime after the incident itself of Steven Avery to hopefully establish a baseline. For those of you who do not know what a nonverbal baseline is, it's a person's nonverbal communication at rest or as they would normally act in a situation. This is used to be able to establish positive and negative spikes in their baseline to hopefully unearth possible deception, or at very least the psychological processing behind the nonverbal tells being displayed. So there's a segment of that, and then there's going to be interview footage from the night of the incident itself, where I would find the most accurate nonverbal read on Steven Avery possible. Now, if this was a perfect world, I would have been able to sit down and speak with Avery and question him specifically in order to invoke certain behavioral and nonverbal patterns from him throughout the interrogation, but I do not have that option. I'm simply going to work with what I have here, but that means that it is less accurate than if it were in real life. For those of you who don't know, nonverbal communication is at best 70 to 80% accurate. There is always a possibility of a misinterpretation. And as more and more obstacles come between a nonverbal analyst and the person being interrogated, the less and less accurate it is going to become. So where I could possibly be able to push Avery in person to give a 90 to 100% accuracy, it will be next to impossible to do that here. That being said, this is enough backstory and enough disclaimers. Let's begin the actual analysis.
I'm not sure. Shouldn't be much longer though. Shouldn't be much longer. I would think by the end of today it'll be ready. What car was it again?
I want to point out a few things right off here. First, we'll start with the nonverbals of Steven. You can see that he's leaned back, he's relaxed, and he has open body language. Also, he's intentionally doing a nod throughout this as he's listening to the interrogator speak. This is actually something that I noticed in Steven's nonverbal repertoire throughout all of my studies during this case, is that he does this intentional nod often after statements and while listening to people. And if this is intentional, this is a manipulation tactic. It's easier to get people to go along with you if you are nodding in this specific culture. This is American culture where a nod is an affirmative movement. So with this sort of intentional movement, this could be something that he learned over time to help manipulate people to see eye to eye with him. Regardless, it is something that sticks out to me as part of his nonverbal baseline. He does this regularly. So if I see this pop up, it's something that I'm keeping note of, but I also know that it's in his baseline. If I see something that strays from that, that is a red flag for me. Also, let's talk a little bit about the fact that it's one, horrible video quality because law enforcement refuses to update their stuff into this century. And then two, it's also horrible audio quality. And once again, it's because law enforcement refuses to update their equipment into this century. I don't know why you can't just invest in a little bit higher quality camera. Regardless, these are nitpicky things. If you can't hear, trust me, you're not alone. I'm not going to add subtitles to this because that takes actual ages and I don't have enough time. But hopefully the auto-generated titles are able to help clear it up some. If not, try to wear some headphones and plug along with. The important thing in this is going to be his body language anyway, so the words aren't as crucial. That's enough talking. Let's keep watching.
Okay, work pretty fast.
They were delivered by Earl.
I'm sorry? By Earl's where you want it?
Yeah.
Okay, sure. That shouldn't be a problem. Like we talked about the Miranda, remember that again? So you just don't want to talk with us, you said? Yes?
Just atrocious audio quality, but speaking again on Avery's nonverbal communication, you could see that the interrogator is moving around regularly, sitting forward some, gesturing some, leaning against the wall. He's moving consistently, and Avery has not moved at all. Now, there are some theories behind this sort of display of nonverbal communication. It can be an indicator of somebody who has no empathy. It could be an indicator of a psychopathic behavior, but this is not a diagnosis on Avery's mental state. If you would like something along those lines, go check out Dr. Grande's video. He has a solid representation of Avery's mental state. But without seeing nonverbal mirroring, this means that at very least, Steven Avery is on a different psychological page than the interrogator, which I would understand if I were in Avery's position and I had been wrongfully accused of a crime from this same law enforcement before. I would be less likely to be interested to be working with them later on or being interrogated by them later on. Also, I forgot to note, in the case with Steven and Teresa, the same people that were involved in his wrongfully accused case before are also in charge of this case. That's a horrible conflict of interest, which I find disgusting, and they should never have allowed that to happen, which is part of my disgust for the law enforcement on this side. But this isn't nonverbal. We're going to get back to that.
What were we talking about before? Oh, geez, probably. What was feeling those things on you?
I may be taking a few notes, okay, but we certainly want to address the,
I cannot hear what's going on here. I couldn't understand it on the initial footage. I tried to make this more audibly understandable, and it's still just going horribly. Let's talk a little bit about Steven Avery's body language, though. Whenever this second person comes into the room, Steven shifts his chair to be able to adjust to both people in the room. This means that he's conscious at least of where he is non-verbally. He has also been doing some mouth-touching gestures, which could be a sign of self-soothing. It often is in stressful situations a sign of a self-soothing gesture, which I understand in this case as well. And you'll see this open hand nod. That's the conscious movement that is in Steven Avery's baseline. And it's a little odd. It doesn't seem to match up all the time, and that's why I feel that it's an intentionally done thing that Avery is doing to try to help manipulate people to being on his side. I'm open and I'm nodding. It seems forced and it seems intentional, and it likely is in his repertoire.
So there was a 22 in the house?
Yeah.
Okay. And whose was that?
Rolly Johnson.
Rolly Johnson?
Yeah.
Where was that kept?
Hanging up in my bedroom.
Hanging up in your bedroom. How long have you lived there, Steve?
I don't know.
Well, have you lived there since, for a year, 2 years, 3 years?
Probably over a year.
Probably over a year? Okay. Prior to that, where were you living?
In a shack.
So right now they're asking baseline questions. They're establishing a baseline, not non-verbally, but they are establishing a baseline by asking generic, non-implicating questions, and this is helping me see how he processes. He's not displaying a lot of nerves during this situation, which means that he's in control of his non-verbal communication as he is in his baseline. So if I see something from this more stationary, sedentary baseline, if I see spikes both positive and negative, then that will allow me to know that there is something going on with his psychological processing. Negative are going to be less likely due to how still his baseline normally is, but if there are spikes, they will show up on the positive side. Let's keep watching to find out if that happens.
The ice shack? Okay. Who are you living with there now?
For myself.
For yourself? Or what's your girlfriend?
My girlfriend in county jail.
Okay. Prior to that, was she living with you?
Yeah.
Okay. I got it. A little over a year, around a year you've been living in there.
Probably somewhere, I don't know.
And the 22 is
Rolly
Rolly Johnson's. He just forgot it there, or just left it there, or what?
Well, he's got a lot of stuff there.
There's a lot of stuff there. Okay.
So in case you're having trouble hearing, they're talking about his relationship with his girlfriend, how long they've lived together, and you can see still this nodding, very intentional, broad nodding from Steven. And this is just part of his baseline, along with the occasional palm flash that you'll see of open body language. Like I said, these seem to be intentional, nonverbal displays from Steven.
Have you ever been out shooting it, just target practicing or anything?
No.
No. Okay. What about any other shooting or anything like that? Because I talked to Earl, and he said you guys on Friday Friday, we were doing a little target practice, sighting in a gun for,
Yeah, he was, yeah.
he was? He had mentioned that you had been shooting it too?
No.
No?
No, he just did.
Okay, what were you guys shooting at?
Now, you'll notice that as he's saying yes and no, his head is reflecting his words. It's a yes and it's a no. And this is good to note early on in this baseline establishing period, because if we see that desynchronized later, there's the possibility that that is extra psychological processing and it could be a sign of deceit. So noticing it here, noticing that that is regularly synchronized for him, is important to be able to note before diving into the rest of the actual interview that happened the night of the incident.
Second card down there.
Having cards, yeah. Okay. What kind of gun was that? 30-06. We sighted in for deer hunting or something? We're coming up pretty soon.
You see him do an uncertain scratch of the head here. This can be all sorts of things, but it could also just be a scratch of the head. You have to keep this in mind, is that a person will still do bodily movements that don't necessarily reflect an emotive state, but it is still something that you should keep note of because it could be a reflection of an emotive state and you're just not sure early on. So I've made note of that as well.
It doesn't seem like it was as warm as it's been at night.
Yeah.
So that was Friday you guys were sighting in?
Yeah.
What time of day was that on Friday?
Sometime in the afternoon.
Afternoon? After
After
lunch?
12 o'clock, yeah.
Okay.
So when Stephen recalls, when he's recollecting something, you could see that he looks down and off to the side lightly. That's where he has looked now repeatedly throughout this little blip of establishing a baseline that we're working with to be able to recall certain details. So whenever we see later footage of him, we would expect to see him look down and off to the side for recollection of genuine details. If we see that differently, then that could be an indicator of deceit. We just have to keep note of it.
Where were you doing that? Like by the house or down in the junkyard, or where were you sighting it?
Down by the crush cars.
Down by the crushed cars. What were you shooting? What were you shooting at?
We should have a donor and a hole.
Did you hit it?
Yeah, he hit it.
You did. That's pretty good. How far away were you?
I don't know, 50 yards maybe.
50 yards.
No, somewhere. I don't know.
That's pretty good.
So once again, he's asked about a detail and he looks down to the same direction as he has the other time. This means that this is a reliable tell of genuine recollection from Stephen. That's important for us to be able to note in his baseline, because then that means later on, if he doesn't do this tell of recollection, there's the possibility and even the likelihood that it's not genuine recollection, but instead him trying to fabricate an answer.
So explain, I'm not sure, I was only down in the junkyard once. Where exactly are the crushed cars?
They're behind Chunky down the road.
Behind Chunky down the road. That road goes behind,
Down in the pit.
goes down the pit.
We could see him using illustrators with his hands as well. This means that in his baseline, if this is a reliable segment, which it's not totally reliable, just to be very clear, this is not a totally reliable system for establishing a baseline, because I'm not in control of establishing the baseline. I'm having to go off of somebody else's work. So it's never going to be as accurate as I would like it to be. But if this is accurate, which I think it's going to be as accurate as we can get right now, he also uses illustrators with his hands. So if we see that being stowed away, later on, that could be an indicator of a negative spike.
And so the road goes like this.
Yeah.
And where are the crushed cars? And here's Chuck's place.
Then the crush cars are right below the hill.
Right below the hill. Okay. There's a crusher there too?
Yeah.
Okay. So you were shooting from where at the crushed cars?
Girl parked a truck someplace in here.
Uh-huh.
Up by the front row of them cars. Then we're shooting out.
Shoot that way. There's a bunch of crushed cars down there.
Yeah.
See that?
Yeah.
Where did those come from? Did you crush those or who crushed those?
I mean, Earl crushed some and then he crushed some and
So you can see in here that the interrogator has started semi-mirroring Stephen's body language. Stephen hasn't really changed his general pose this entire interrogation that we've seen so far, but the interrogator is now mirroring Stephen. Now, this could either be unconsciously done from the interrogator just trying to be on the same page as a person. That will happen in a person's subconscious mind, is as they want to be on the same page of another person, their body will begin to mirror them. Alternatively, it could be a consciously done thing as well, to where the interrogator is now mirroring Stephen so that they can feel subconsciously that they are on the same page. Both of those work in this instance, but it is important to note that Stephen has not changed his body language for it. This does indicate that he is not psychologically on the same page as the interrogator. There is a psychological distancing that is happening there, ergo the lack of mirroring body language.
There's still someone after the crash, yeah.
Okay. Do you guys normally crush your own cars, or does somebody usually crush them?
Probably Norris.
Norm does? How come you decided to crush them this time yourself?
Would you like to crush her there?
Oh, okay.
Is there we want to use it, we can use it.
So is there a key in the thing or something?
Yeah.
So he doesn't mind if you use it?
No.
Okay. I noticed the one time I was down there that there was a car in there, in the crusher. A blue car.
Yeah.
Who crushed that one?
I did.
You did? When did you crush that one?
I did want to make note of that fidget that Stephen did there at the very end, where he scratched at his suprasternal notch. This could be a pacifying gesture, a self-soothing gesture. The suprasternal notch is an area that many people will touch if they are feeling under stress. This will oftentimes show up more so in women than it will in men. However, it still is possible across the board. That being said, I don't feel that it was related. From what I can barely hear of this conversation, none of his nonverbal antics during this interrogation are a direct result of questioning from the interrogation, but that just means that it's a reliable area for a baseline. It's just general, basic questions that don't have a lot of weight or stress behind them. And that helps me establish that. This wraps up more or less the baseline segment. We know that his baseline does not display a lot of positive activity. It's pretty sedentary with some very intentional gestures, especially the opening of the palms and the nodding. And we also know that it is pretty synchronized, where he says no, he shakes no, where he says yes, he does yes. And he also will occasionally use illustrators, not all the time, but occasionally. So we would expect to see that sort of behavior throughout his interviews if he's being authentic or if he is not experiencing intense psychological stress. So in this next interview, the night of the incident, which should be the most raw, meaning that it should be the most accurate non-verbally, if we see different displays than we saw here, it is a red flag. I will say this, I have not watched this interview. I wanted to be able to go into this segment of the read with as little bias as I possibly could. I wanted to be able to do my research, understand everything that I could, establish a baseline, and then look at this interview for the first time with you right now. I have never seen this before.